This week, we'll be going over descriptive research. Following this lecture, you'll be able to find descriptive research in general, be able to identify specific types of research approaches. Also, you'll be able to describe correlational research approaches, be able to create appropriate questions for surveys or questionnaires, and lastly, be able to recognize situations where developmental or observational research approaches should be used. So in our last lecture, we discussed experimental research. And in this research, we're trying to manipulate a variable in order to establish a cause-effect relationship. So although experimental research is probably the most widely used within exercise science, it's not the only way to acquire knowledge within the health sciences. So this is where descriptive research can play a role and can provide some valuable insight into many issues that exist around us, such as physical activity and then different nutritional strategies that best fit individuals to kind of lose weight or gain weight. A thing with descriptive research is that it's a precursor to experimental research. So researchers who use descriptive research, will collect information related to a certain interest, and then will use that information to depict its current status. So this helps us start to see if there's, some sort of relationship which we can, manipulate experimentally later. Descriptive research can be defined as studies that captures important characteristics of the participants without experimental manipulation. So with descriptive research, you're trying to capture thoughts, attitudes, behaviors, physical attributes, and then other characteristics at a certain time point. Some examples that we can capture are age and gender, height, weight, and by capturing height and weight, we can then calculate body mass index or BMI. We can also look at some physiological measures such as physical activity or even strength. When we look at, descriptive research, individuals may not consider this, quote unquote research as real research compared to experimental research. However, though, descriptive research is necessary to help guide our decisions related to experimental interventions. So say we want to kind of investigate obesity here at Lindenwood University. To start, you will want to get the number of students that are enrolled here. And after you get that number, you can then break down the students into different grade levels, such as freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors, and then graduate students. Or if you want, you could set an age range, since some individuals may take a year or two before starting college, or come back to college after, being out in the job field for a long time. After that, you will need to determine a measure that will, capture information relating to, obesity. And the best way to determine that is through looking at BMI, which is, again, a ratio of, weight to height. So for an individual to be classified as overweight, their BMI will fall in between 25 to 29.9. And then for an individual to be classified as obese, their BMI will be 30 or more. So once you capture that information, this is, kind of a good start, but you always want to know, how physically active the students are, or, another question that you can come up with. So probably the most popular method on determining physical activity and how that plays a role in obesity here on campus is looking at, steps per day by using a pedometer. So we can use this information as a kind of a rough guide before we can utilize, other descriptive techniques. Once you have obtained the BMI and the amount of physical activity students perform, you can then see if there's a relationship between obesity and the amount of physical activity. So examining the relationship between or among variables such as these two is called correlational research. Correlational research can be defined as studies that examine relationships between or among important variables. And with this research, the research doesn't try to manipulate or change the relationship, but rather describe the relationship as it is currently existing. So relationships can be positive, where the variables increase or decrease together, or they can be negative, where one variable increases as the other decreases. The last relationship is no relationship, and this is where the variables are independent of each other. When it comes to correlational research, the stronger the correlation between the two variables, the better the ability to predict the value of one variable when the others are known. And this can be for positive or negative relationships. We'll go into a bit more on correlational relationship through statistical analysis later in the semester. But an important function of correlational research is that it lays the foundation for future experimental research by establishing an association between or among variables. So with our example, you can start plotting the variables on an XY graph. You can then determine the strength of the relationship between the variables by looking at the scatter of points on the graph. So if you see a pattern, some sort of relationship probably exists. Here in the figure to the right, you can see the pattern has a negative relationship, whereas the individuals who have a high physical activity level will have a lower BMI. One important thing to note is that both variables that you choose need to be independent of each other, meaning you don't really want the variables measuring or calculating the same thing. So for example, if you are looking at BMI and you want to look at the actual energy expenditure, both are calculated using body weight, which they are not independent of each other since they're both looking at body weight. And by doing so, this may give the appearance of a positive relationship between two seemingly independent variables, where you say BMI and energy expenditure, they're on the surface looks quite different, but looking at it a little bit more deeply, since they're both calculating weight, they're not really independent of each other. However, there may be some cases where the researchers want to look for correlation between variables that are supposed to measure the same thing. This is a way to help validate items on questionnaires or equipment, such as comparing the underwater weighing technique, which is considered the gold standard of calculating fat mass and fat-free mass, to the DEXA scan, which is another measurement to test for body composition. Through the use of statistics, we can determine the significance and strength of the relationship. Again, strong correlations allow us to predict one variable from the other. A thing though with correlational relationships is that you cannot make a conclusion. We can only say that the variables are related. So even if you have a very strong correlation, this does not mean causation. And with this, you will need to follow up with an experiment to really determine that one causes the other. Another method utilized in descriptive research is survey research. Survey research allows researchers to get information that is more detailed from individuals by asking them questions about their activities, their behaviors, or their attitudes. This is looking at it qualitative, where the dependent variables are non-numerical and can be obtained through questioning participants. Survey research is primarily used in social and behavioral sciences. However, individuals who are in sport and exercise psychology and biobehavioral health will also often utilize survey research. Surveys are collected in conjunction with quantitative measures such as numerical numbers such as height and weight and so forth of the dependent variables to better interpret the results. There are different types of survey techniques. The two most common types are questionnaires and interviews. When creating a survey on the surface, it seems easy, but there are things to consider to ensure your results are validated. One is that you must carefully plan on what you want to ask, and then also how you want to ask. This will maximize the validity of the response and minimize errors from the respondents. Also, how you ask can also impact the individual's response. So say, for example, you want to ask how many minutes of physical activity do you get each day? So this may seem as a straight, to the point question. However, there are some issues. With physical activity, it may mean, different between different individuals, where one individual will think physical activity as a structured exercise, such as, sets and repetitions, while another individual will think of, any type of movement that expends calories as, physical activity. Also, there may be some day-to-day variability on the amount of physical activity per day. So one day might consist of 20 minutes of physical activity, while another day may consist of 60 minutes, and say another day just consists of 10 minutes. So to better way to avoid these types of issues is asking, on average, how many days a week are you physically active for more than 30 minutes? Or another way to ask is how many total minutes per week do you engage in physical activity? So you can see that you really had to think when asking these questions to the population. And when you're asking these questions, you need to kind of consider also, what population you're asking these questions to as well. Questionnaires can provide a good, quick method of gathering data on behaviors, habits, or attitudes. A well-constructed questionnaire consists of a series of questions that will provide insight into some aspect of, human nature. So for novice researchers, it is ideal to look for published questionnaires that have already been validated rather than making up your own questionnaire. However, though, even experienced researchers will still utilize published questionnaires in their research studies. Also, as time goes on and you get more experience, you can start making up your own questionnaires and then start comparing those to the published questionnaires. The questionnaires are administered, one at a time, or it can be administered to a large group setting, such as the classroom. Additionally, questionnaires can be distributed through paper mail or through the internet. The questionnaire formation is mainly closed questions, but may sometimes contain open-ended questions. Open-ended questions do not have specific responses, so the respondents have an opportunity to formulate their own response, kind of like a short essay response. But open-ended questions within the questionnaire can help the researcher kind of identify themes in a response. However, though, there are a couple disadvantages. One disadvantage of open-ended questions is that they kind of require both thought and action, which may make some people hesitant to, take the questionnaire, or they may think that it's going to take too much time whenever they are answering these open-ended questions. Another disadvantage is that you need to consider how you can analyze these responses. So remember that good research is repeatable, and it's difficult to replicate the study if the questions are open-ended. But when we think of with closed questions, these provide an embedded answer that the respondent can either circle, check, or list. Another type of question that can be utilized is the Likert scale, and this allows the respondent to provide some sort of answer that falls along a continuum. Here are some examples of closed questions. Here on the left, you can see that the respondent selects the most appropriate answer relating to the question. So you're probably most familiar with this, as this is often seen in quizzes and exams that you take. The second example on the right provides more than one answer. And this is where, there's a list that provides, different options where the respondent can choose one or more of the selected, options. Here's an example of the Likert scale. So this provides a numerical value to a particular question. So there isn't a correct answer for this, but is more providing the best opinion of the question. And you can see here on the example is it asks, how much does your participation in physically active recreation decline during periods of bad air pollution? And gives you, examples such as walking outside, light sports, moderate sports, and so forth, and gives you some sort of, value based off of the question. Kind of another example that you may, be more familiar with is, rating a scale of hardness on a class, or easiness, such as 1 being really easy, and then a 10 being, very hard. The other example of survey technique is interviews. Interviews obtain more detailed information from a smaller sample of participants. This is usually about 1 to a few individuals at a time. Similar to questionnaires, interviews provide a series of questions related to behaviors, habits, or attitudes of a group. Also, they have a similar criteria as questionnaires where you need to carefully plan what you want to ask and how. The difference, though, between questionnaires and interviews is that the interviews will mainly use open-ended questions rather than closed-ended questions. Although, they may still, utilize some closed-ended questions in interviews. But with the open-ended questions, this is going to require some sort of transcription of responses from an audio or, videotape. Lastly, interviews are administered verbally rather than on paper like questionnaires. Within interviews, there are different types. One is structured interviews. This is where all respondents are asked the same set of questions in the same order, regardless of the individual's response. So, for example, the first question could be, what motivates you to be more physically active? And the following question could be, are there any barriers to physical activity in your life? In semi-structured interviews, which is the next different type of interview, this is where the interviewer has a general framework of questions, but the direction of the interview will go depending on the answers made by the respondent. So this is where the interviewer may kind of probe more deeply into the response and trying to get more details on the respondent's thoughts, attitudes, experience, or behavior. So, for example, you can ask the question, what sort of things motivates you to, be more physically active? And they give some sort of response where you can say, friends, parents, significant others give, some sort of motivation, or, some sort of sport gives you some sort of motivation. And then the follow-up question would be, kind of playing onto that. So you say your friends, your family, and whatever motivates you during these specific times. Do they motivate you on any other times? So that's just kind of an example where you're kind of probing more deeply to find out a little bit more information about that individual's attitudes. In certain situations, researchers will want to know more detail on the impact of an intervention, therapy, or educational setting. So this is where case studies are utilized. Case studies are a detailed description of an individual, a group, intervention, or therapeutic or educational setting. Case studies are descriptive research, meaning that the researcher isn't manipulating anything. So with this, the researcher can provide individualized description of certain changes over time. So, for example, we can look at having a case study of an individual on kind of their dietary habits over the course of 2 years, and seeing how their body composition changes, see if their blood pressure changes, and then other variables such as their HDL and LDL content, and see if that changes. However, though, a disadvantage of case studies is that there's no way to objectively assess causation. Developmental research examines the changes over time and sees the interacting influences on different aspects of health, such as physical activity, blood pressure, muscle mass, cardiovascular system, any other type of system that you're interested in, or any other variables based on your research problem. But in general, we are examining participants at different ages or points in their development. With this, age is referred to as the independent variable. The different examinations of the different measures at the key time points are the dependent variables. So there are two different study designs that are utilized in developmental research. One is the longitudinal research design, and the second is the cross-sectional research design. So the longitudinal research design describes a small group of individuals over a long period. This can last several months or even years. This is kind of considered, though, the gold standard when investigating any developmental changes. So, for example, of a longitudinal study design is following, say, 10 children for 15 years at the start of, 3 years old. And during this time, you would take certain measurements every year and see how those kind of change across the age. The cross-sectional research design describes different age groups at one point in time to simulate the process of development. This is a shortened version to describing developmental changes. So rather than tracking a couple individuals for many months or years, like the longitudinal research design, you can take the measurements at one time point from 5 different groups of participants. So going back to our example, you can split it up into different age ranges, say from 3 to 5, 6 to 8, 9 to 11, 12 to 14, and then 15 to 17 years old. So even though this allows the researchers to complete developmental research in a shorter time period, there are some issues. A big one is that it doesn't allow or kind of provide as much information on the research or the aging process, compared to longitudinal research designs. The last thing we'll go over is observational research. This type of research observes participants for an overall time period. During this type of research, researchers observe systematically on certain behaviors at periodic intervals. They also may incorporate some sort of equipment or tool, such as video recording, to enhance their ability to accurately observe more detail that they may miss in person, or they can go back and look at the video on their own time. For example, if you wanted to see the amount or the intensity of physical activity in a Little League baseball game for certain players, you can check for any active behavior such as running the bases or fielding the ball, or look at passive behavior such as sitting on the bench before batting or standing waiting in between pitches. And this can be done every 5 minutes or 10 minutes, whatever time interval you want to choose. So with this type of research, depending on what you are examining, this may provide a better measurement for your research problem. Some things to complete by Monday, October 26th by 11:59 p.m. is taking quiz 7 and also submitting your article matrix as a Word document or PDF file. Remember, no pictures or screenshots. Please, whenever you are submitting this article matrix, please fill in the outline provided that I give you guys for this assignment.